All right, buckle up, everybody, because we're diving into a huge topic today, the Cold War.
Big one.
And what better way to tackle it than with a map?
Always a good plan. Visuals help.
Absolutely. We're taking a deep dive into this YouTube video, The Cold War Summary on a Map. It's from the channel Geohistory.
Ah, good channel. I've seen some of their stuff. Maps make all the difference, don't they?
It's like seeing history unfold right before your eyes. And this video, it starts us off right where things get interesting. Post-World War II.
Yeah, talk about starting in a tough spot. Europe's devastated. The major powers are completely spent.
Totally. Like the whole world was holding its breath, wondering what would happen next. And that's where, boom, these two superpowers emerge.
The US and the USSR.
Right.
But it's more than just two powerful countries, right? This is also about ideologies clashing on a global scale.
Capitalism versus communism. Talk about a recipe for tension.
Hmm.
On one side, you've got the U.S. capitalist democracy, strong military.
Oh, and let's not forget, the only ones at the time with nuclear weapons.
Right. And then there's the USSR, this massive communist regime controlling a ridiculous amount of land, 1/6 of the earth.
It's mind-boggling when you see it on a map, the sheer scale of it. And here's the thing. That huge landmass wasn't always one big, happy communist family. There were tensions within the bloc itself.
Like what? Give me an example.
Well, the video mentions the USSR breaking with Yugoslavia early on.
Yugoslavia. But they were both communists, right?
Yeah, but Yugoslavia wanted to do its own thing. This split showed that things weren't as unified as they might seem.
Interesting. So even within the communist world, there were different approaches. And speaking of divisions, the video drops a term that always sends chills down my spine, the Iron Curtain.
Oh yeah, Europe. Literally divided, a line drawn right through it, separating the U.S.-influenced West from the Soviet sphere of influence in the East.
Families divided, movement restricted. It wasn't pretty.
Not at all. A very real illustration of how ideology can reshape a map, literally.
Speaking of maps, the video takes us to Berlin, and this is where we see just how tense things could get. The Berlin blockade.
The Soviets trying to squeeze West Berlin, cut it off from the West. It was a huge gamble.
And the response. The Berlin airlift. The West starts flying in supplies day and night. Food, medicine, even coal.
Can you imagine the logistics of that?
It's incredible. Talk about determination on both sides.
Oh, absolutely. And there's that amazing story of the candy bomber, Gail Halvorsen. He starts dropping candy bars attached to parachutes for the kids in Berlin.
I've heard about that.
Such a small act of kindness. But amidst all that tension and fear, it really captured people's imaginations.
A little glimmer of hope. It's amazing how, even in the darkest of times, but the Berlin blockade, it really set the stage for the rest of the Cold War, didn't it?
Absolutely. That constant tension, the maneuvering for position, the feeling that anything could happen.
Like a global chess match.
Exactly.
So we've talked about the Berlin blockade, but the Cold War was a global conflict.
Right. It wasn't confined to one city or even one continent. And that's where this video gets even more fascinating. It explores this idea of proxy wars.
Proxy wars, like instead of fighting each other directly.
Exactly. The US and USSR, they'd support different sides in other conflicts around the world. It was this high-stakes game of chess, but they were playing it out in other people's backyards.
So instead of moving their own pieces on the board,
They're trying to manipulate the whole game. And the video gives us some prime examples. Greece, for instance, right after World War II, they plunge into their own civil war.
communists versus the monarchy,
Yep.
right?
And the superpowers see an opportunity. The Soviets back the communists.
Naturally.
But here's where it gets interesting. Yugoslavia, who'd just broken away from the Soviet sphere of influence, they backed the communist side in Greece too.
So even though they had their own thing going on,
It shows that even within the communist bloc, there were different interpretations, different approaches. Alliances weren't always so clear-cut.
wow, it adds a whole new layer of complexity.
Totally. And speaking of complexity, the video takes us from Europe to Asia. And we all know what happens there, the Chinese Civil War.
Talk about a game changer. Mao Zedong and the communists winning in 1949. That's huge.
Huge. China, this massive country, strategically important, throws its weight behind the communist bloc. Suddenly, the balance of power shifts.
That had to have sent shockwaves through the U.S.
Absolutely. And it leads us right into another proxy war. Korea.
Divided peninsula, right? North versus South.
Exactly. After World War II, Korea, previously under Japanese rule, gets split. The North backed by the Soviets and China, the South by the U.S. and UN forces, and then in 1950, boom, the North invades.
And we have another proxy war on our hands, and this one hits close to home, doesn't it? The Korean War, it's not exactly ancient history.
Sadly, no. It ended in a stalemate in 1953. But the peninsula is still divided today. Millions of lives lost. It really highlights how quickly these proxy conflicts could escalate.
The stark reminder of the human cost of the Cold War, even when it wasn't the superpowers themselves on the front lines. And speaking of devastating wars, the video doesn't shy away from another big one, Vietnam.
Right, Vietnam. That one really shook things up, didn't it? The U.S., despite all its military might, ends up losing.
It kind of tarnished their image on the world stage, didn't it?
Big time.
Yeah.
The video emphasizes how that defeat really fueled anti-war sentiment back home in the U.S., too.
Vietnam, it makes you think about all the different sides of a conflict, the different perspectives. It wasn't so simple as good guys and bad guys.
Not at all. And that's what made the Cold War so complex
Yeah.
and so fascinating.
These proxy wars were really heating things up around the world. But this video you shared, it doesn't just focus on those conflicts, does it?
You're right, it doesn't. It also dives into the technological side of the Cold War. Remember that arms race we talked about?
Oh, yeah. And with those intercontinental ballistic missiles, things got very, very serious. Suddenly, it wasn't just about fighting wars on the ground.
It was about who could hit the other guy's doorstep with a nuke and who could do it faster. And the scariest part, the video really brings this home when it talks about the Cuban Missile Crisis.
13 days in October of 1962. The world held its breath. I mean, seriously, when you look back at it, it's amazing how close we came to nuclear war. The Soviets putting missiles in Cuba.
90 miles off the coast of Florida.
Yeah. Talk about a tense standoff. But what I find fascinating is that it wasn't like either side was stumbling towards Armageddon blindly. Both Kennedy and Khrushchev, they understood what was at stake.
Absolutely.
Right.
That's the thing about mutually assured destruction. As terrifying as it is, it might have been the very thing that prevented it.
So crazy question, but do you think that's why they backed down? Like the weight of that responsibility?
I think it played a huge role. The video mentions Khrushchev agreed to remove the missiles from Cuba.
Right, and the U.S. secretly agreed to remove some missiles from Turkey, too.
A bit of a trade-off, but hey, it worked. It wasn't the end of the Cold War, not by a long shot. But it did lead to a bit of a thaw. A little more communication. Remember that hotline they set up?
Between Washington and Moscow, yeah. A direct line to hopefully avoid any more misunderstandings that could end, badly. But even with all of that, the video makes it clear that the cracks were starting to show, like with China distancing itself from the USSR.
Right. We talked about Yugoslavia breaking away earlier, but China, that's huge. It really shows that the Cold War wasn't as simple as us versus them. Even within the communist bloc, there were tensions, disagreements.
Yeah, and it wasn't always about picking a side either. The video mentions this non-aligned movement, and I think that's worth digging into a little bit.
Definitely. This was a group of countries, many of them newly independent nations in Africa, Asia, and Latin America that were like, you know what? We're not picking sides. We're doing our own thing.
Talk about a power move, especially with all the pressure they were facing back then.
Right. But while all that was going on, the video shifts our focus back to the USSR and their, shall we say, less than successful adventure in Afghanistan.
Afghanistan, 1979. Talk about a turning point.
It really exposed the weaknesses within the Soviet system. They went in thinking it'd be quick, but they got bogged down in a guerrilla war, the Mujahideen, backed by the U.S.
A little payback for Vietnam, maybe?
It's possible.
Yeah.
But either way, it was costly for the Soviets. And speaking of costly, let's not forget the economic strain of trying to keep up with the U.S. militarily. That arms race really took its toll.
By the late 80s, Gorbachev's trying to reform the system with glasnost and perestroika, openness, restructuring. But these reforms, they were a direct response to all the pressure they were facing, weren't they?
Absolutely. The economic strain, the war in Afghanistan,
Yeah.
the Soviet system was feeling the heat.
And then in 1989, the Berlin Wall comes down.
An iconic moment. That wall, a symbol of division for so long, just crumbles.
It's incredible, and it really set the stage for the end of the Cold War, didn't it? By 1991, the Soviet Union itself is gone.
Gone. Just like that.
Wow. This video, it wasn't just a history lesson. It was like a front row seat to one of the most intense periods in human history.
Seeing it unfold on a map,
Yeah.
it really hits home how interconnected everything was.
Absolutely. The ideologies, the conflicts, the technological advancements, it all intertwined to shape the world we live in today. And it makes you wonder, what will people in the future say about the maps of our time? What stories will they tell? That's something to think about, isn't it?
It really is.